Well, I am so excited to be joined here today for our health equity series that we're doing with some of our industry leaders. And today we're joined by Mr. Daniel Perez, who serves as the Director and Global Head of Health Equity for Worldwide Clinical Trials. Daniel brings over 15 years of clinical research experience in a variety and progressive roles from institutions like Cedars-Sinai and Children's Hospital of LA, and most recently at Macro, where he served as the CEO of an organization that was committed to bringing greater access to patients of color and community. And so today, Daniel, some of the things that really stood out to me from your background, and as we think about the term of health equity, it's just concept of, and it was a quote by Van Gogh, that great things are not done by impulse, but by a series of small things brought together. And so today, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you, your role, and your thoughts on health equity. And so, I understand that your background is one of integrity, of diligence, and purpose. And so I'd love to learn, what is the definition of health equity to you?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for that intro. I appreciate it. It's really interesting when we see things like that Van Gogh quote, right? When they come together and you kind of reflect on what that journey trajectory has been like and all the things that I've worked on and the amazing people I've had the privilege to be a part of a team with. Health equity, it's interesting, right? Because it wasn't a deliberate career path for me. When I started my career at Cedars-Sinai, I looked at the organization, the hospital, the clinicians, the team, with a sense of responsibility to heal. A very simple, philosophy for me is healing. And what does that mean? There's healing of the literal body and the ailments and the diseases and the conditions. And then there is the continuity of that health with your wellness of your mental health and your emotional health. And also understanding, one of the things I bring up is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we all fall in one or the other rungs, where the lower rung is the basic need for straight up survival. And as we make our way up, we inch our way closer to no longer having to worry about where the next meal is coming from, no longer having to worry about having a roof over my head. But then we elevate to this new Maslow hierarchy of need. And every step of the way, we're reaching and striving for the top, which is self-realization, where you no longer worry about all of the things of basic needs and survival, and you can come to a point in your life where you want to truly understand what your purpose is and why you're here to do something. It's very mission driven. It's very much where the role that creativity plays in that space. And the reason why I say that is because when I think about health equity, the key word to unpack is equity. We're not talking about equality. We're not talking about equal. We're talking about equity. And I think that, we as human beings have different starting points in our lives. Some of us are born into different environments, economic status, etc. And we have some reconciling to do on that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I talk about, my mom, she was a single parent and she lived paycheck to paycheck, right? She was a housekeeper, and if she needed to take a day off, you don't work, you don't get paid. There's no PTO, there's no sick time, there's no pension, none of that. And she would very cautiously pick the days that she would take off, and whenever that happened, it was to take me to the doctor's office or me to my dentist appointment, etc. And I bring that up because this is an individual who would not go to primary care, preventative care, screenings, mammograms, things of that nature. Yet and still, one can argue, right, the different stressors and layers of impact of someone like that on their health, on their mental health, their emotional health, and then their body's health. And then we get to a situation where, fortunately now, she's ascended the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I've been able to help her out, and she can focus on her health. And thank goodness she is, healthy all around. But her sister, that was not the case. Sister had very similar background. My aunt brought up her child the same way, single mother. And it wasn't until one day she was in excruciating pain. and went into the hospital to find out that she had a very large tumor, and she passed away of colorectal cancer. It was stage 4 and it was metastasized. Now, we're talking about multiple barriers. We're talking about the economic impediment to be able to literally just break out of that lower rung of survival. I cannot not get paid. And then talking about health insurance status and the ability to receive quality care. And in addition to that, the health literacy gap and component of someone like my aunt or my mom having to understand the importance of what preventative care is and the importance of screenings. I didn't know what that was. And all of that contributed to the unfortunate outcome in my aunt's case. And even then, right? All those years ago, there were viable treatment options in the form of clinical trials. And she may have closed these these health literacy gaps. She may have closed all of that. And she received care at Cedars-Sinai, an institution that has had, continues to have world-class, cutting-edge, industry-leading clinical research. Why was someone like her not approached, qualified for certainly, a panel of clinical trials? So we're looking at multi-layers of peeling the layers of an onion. Mm-hmm. And that's only one dimension. When we think about the breadth of what the role plays of sexual gender minorities, that may have highly stigmatized interactions with providers, topics around HIV and the role that HIV exclusion criteria has historically played in clinical research. There are very many. And so for me, health equity is zooming out and looking at the robust breadth of the dynamic, elements at play with just receiving care. Because that's what health equity is about, is just receiving care. Because all the drugs that we are, leading and supporting in the development phase, these patients are going to get diagnosed with these conditions, and hey, guess what? The cycle kind of rebirths around because now you're thinking about the patient pathway. So I think, with regards to health equity, the starting point really is having a robust aperture and understanding of what that continuum looks like. And I think in clinical research specifically, we may oftentimes make the mistake of making an assumption that you need to be highly specialized with a clinical research background, which is just not the case. We understand the continuum to be a lot broader than that. So that's.
Thank you so much. And I can tell that health equity, it is multi-layered. And I appreciate that you brought in some of the personal elements to really help underscore and highlight the various components. And it's interesting that you mentioned the Maslow's hierarchy, because it's something that I've often thought about as well, which is when you are seeking to maybe even have conversation with a prospective patient that perhaps could qualify for a trial, depending on perhaps where they might be in that hierarchy. Is it really the appropriate timing, right? Or to your point, if one's worried about the time off of work, not having insurance, and sometimes standard of care is best practice for some of the study inclusion-exclusion criteria, or there's chronic conditions that people face that are consistently considered exclusionary criteria. Right. So, I guess when we think about it from that perspective, I'd love to better understand your perspective too on when we think about why health equity is important and thinking about the roles that CROs might play in this part versus a sponsor, and especially when we think about real patient lives and journeys in all of this, can you help us better understand, what your thoughts are as far as breaking that down a little bit?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I've often thought about where in the constituency of, to your point, right, our pharma sponsors, the role that the CROs play, the role and impact that the site plays, the role and impact that patient advocacy groups as well can play in that element. And one of the things that comes to mind as you were asking that question is the challenge and the complexity of psychiatric clinical trials. The reason why I say that is because oftentimes we may see, maybe let's say for a major depression study, we may see exclusionary criteria of history of bipolar disorder. Now, these are questions that sites may routinely, as part of pre-screening, being on the phone with patients or even in clinic or what have you, ask them that question. And the way I see this is the disparity in mental health access makes it so that by the time a person who's experiencing a mental health emergency and they're in the emergency department, that is their diagnosis point. And disproportionately, Black Americans will oftentimes be the demographic finding themselves in the emergency room. And without a thorough evaluation, will just be like, they'll be assigned that category with the ICD-10 code. It is bipolar disorder. So if I'm contacted for a study and someone asks me that question over the phone, my default response is yes. And where does the sponsor play a role in understanding that impact? Well, number one, asking the sites what this pre-screen process looks like. Number two, developing a pre-screen modality that captures that demographic data. Historically, it's patient date of birth, initials, and why did they pre-screen fail? We can't correlate that data. We can't segment it. We can't find trends in understanding, we're seeing consistent exclusionary criteria for this, segment it into which demographic and make informed assumptions that way. That matters because maybe a protocol amendment can go on and define you need a psychiatrist board certified diagnosis. And if the patient either does not know or the answer is, well, I was diagnosed in the emergency room, then part of that protocol should allow for come on site for, as part of that schedule of events and understand, the nuances there. Now, of course, you're unpacking many different wires to that with Medicare compliance and, the ability to pay for certain procedures, et cetera. But we're looking at this continuum. Now, in the middle somewhere sits the CRO. I think that the design of implementation of health equity strategies, period, the sponsor should be supported by the CRO in doing that. The CRO has an opportunity to generate a wealth of knowledge and expertise with the right systems in place, with the right people in place, with the right dedicated service lines for health equity that historically have not been there. Because the role that a CRO can play is in supporting to facilitate upstream before this even happens. As the sponsor is looking at, country by country site selection, as the sponsor is being guided with their, commercialization strategies, et cetera, the CRO has the ability to influence that stream of health equity, to start to do that type of analysis. Now, one can argue that commitments under the new requirements from executive order hold the sponsors accountable, not the CROs. The CROs acting, as an authority on behalf of the sponsors, with the contracting mechanisms, you can't dissolve the accountability to the IND that the sponsor ultimately holds. And that's what we're really talking about, right? It's the responsibility of the sponsor to understand who they're gonna partner up as their CRO partner and fulfill the whole continuum of their IND requirements, which now calls for diversity action plans. And sites must continue to, in a supported capacity, feel empowered and have the vehicle and the channel across CRO and sponsor, because oftentimes, me coming from the site perspective, the CRO becomes the black box that eliminates transparency and visibility of the site with the sponsor. And I think there needs to, as part of the overarching strategy, include that voice very intimately, as we're conducting the study. So that's kind of how I think about the responsibilities of the different folks in the space.
Oh, that's a really interesting component. So what are some ideas or concepts that our industry might want to consider to really make sure that the CROs can act as the arms and legs in an informed way that reflects the needs of what's been outlined in the executive order, what's been outlined in the DEPICT Act, because some of these organizations, they don't either have the people power, so they need a viable partner. And I'd love to better understand, how could we bridge that gap, bridge that divide to make sure that there could be enhanced transparency, communication, and and really collaboration to ensure that we can advance advancing, operationalizing these concepts.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'll say this, right? The executive order that comes to the FDA via the DEPICT Act, which of course we've all been anxiously waiting for the updated guidance to come out, and we expect the dimensions of diversity to expand in the updated, guidance. But the reason why I mention is because the current iteration provides a very general framework for what these diversity action plans look like. We look categorically at the 5 sections and we have a sense of direction. But one can look at that and go, diversity action plan was a page and a half. Or if we extrapolate, it can grow into 15 plus, 20 plus pages. And you're looking at the birth of a standalone regulatory document deserving of its own place and respect in the filings with regulatory agencies like the FDA. Yet and still, who develops them, whether the sponsor or through outsourced scoping of services, the CRO, still, nonetheless, the diversity action plan commitments are shouldered by the sponsor. They cannot go to the agency and say, well, our CRO said that and it didn't happen, so actually it was our CRO. No, that's your IND, not the CROs, right? And so there's a balance, and I think there's a palpable anxiety in the industry around operationalizing what the FDA has released guidance on. We said that, but what does that mean? It's like, Jack Skellington in Nightmare Before Christmas, like, what does it mean, right? It's so interesting, but how? And I think the idea that I bring to teams and groups and just organizational thinking is that I don't believe that the FDA or even the executive order, I don't think that the ask is to invent a new wheel. In fact, I think the push is to get the existing ingredients that make up an effective clinical trial, the people, the functional teams, data management, project management, CRA workforce, clinical operations, regulatory. I think the call is to get you to think differently. I think the call is to add an angle that you historically have not needed to consider. And so what I do to operationalize a diversity action plan is I'm able to understand the high level strategy and measure. And then I break that down into mechanisms of specific actions, which I know is confusing because one can look at the diversity action plan and go, well, isn't that what that's supposed to do with the action part? But so in order to avoid that confusion, I've started to call it the implementation strategy. One can say we are going to expand demographics. Cool. Do we need to do an EDC build? Who's going to do that EDC build? Oh, data management. Okay, when are they going to do it? What is the deliverable? What is the metric? And when will it get it done? That's a different pathway than just saying we're going to expand demographics and then you file your diversity action plan and we're not going to look at it until 6 months when, oh, well, now we got to do the report to the FDA. Well, what do we do? Nothing, right? And so the point of that document, the key operative word is action plan. It is not diversity enrollment plan. It is diversity action plan. And I think the intent behind that is to demonstrate conscious design on what you're going to do. And perfection is not the goal. When it doesn't work, pivot. And they want to see, FDA want to see, what did you do next? Well, this didn't work. Okay, cool. What did you do next, right? And why? And demonstrate that. Because what is this information going to ultimately drive at the country federal level with regards to segmenting the therapeutic areas, et cetera? It can start to give higher level trends of understanding what might mechanistically or from a regulatory framework be broken. We know it is, but we don't know how to shine a light and pinpoint where. But that granularity is super important. So that, operationalizing diversity action plans is more about demystifying and decoding it into language that functional teams that already exist are doing. Data management, here are the new demographics. Cool, got it. That's all they need to know. Metrics part, here. Oh, GDPR compliance, well, let's go to the compliance. That's what they need to do. Oh, I can do that, right? And so now you're getting teams fired up and excited to do this because they're like, yeah, I can contribute my knowledge base and my expertise, and I see how that connects to the diversity action plan. Now I'm not flustered and anxious. Now I'm like, I got this. And that's what this is about, right? But you do need the shepherd. You do need the person who's going to light the lantern and go, this is how this gets translated. And I would hope, my hope is that in the future, I put myself out of a job so that the industry just thinks this way. There is no need for a standalone person in health equity to always be doing this. If you do this enough times, like the flywheel building momentum, you could let go at some point, and the systems are there, right? And I think that's kind of how I take that approach.
So many good pieces to kind of dive into on that segment, especially when walking through a bit more of your process. And I agree with you. It's a lot like, it sounds like the way that Six Sigma took over with design thinking and iterating and quality. It sounds like some of that when it comes to applying health equity strategies and the way in which you approach your processes of trying to translate and serve as like the shepherd of what the overall really broadly written guidance says, because it does need to be adapted for the specificity of the trial. So can you help us walk us through? I'm fascinated, twofold, and I would love to double back too as far as how organizations and CROs can ensure health equity. But before we go there, I really would like to take a deeper dive into what is your process when you get approached with a new proposal, if you will, or protocol of like, help us understand what is your process when breaking this design down and translating from the overarching depict act guidance to what it actually means in everyday speak that a site and a team can actually execute on?
It's a very messy process, which is a reflection of what I consider a artistic skill. Now, whenever folks ask me like, oh, what do you do? And I look at it like, yeah, the life sciences is very much, whatever sighted brain, I don't butcher that, but the point is, right, you got the creative arts, and then you got the more rigorous empirical scientific process of linear thinking. For me, it's the former. It's the artistic approach. It is the literal sitting at my desk or my kitchen table, which is funny because I historically always ask for a printer. And people are like, what? And I'm like, I know I'm killing trees, but like my creative process requires me to touch stuff on the table. And so I just, it's like going to the grocery store. I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to cook this recipe. Cool. I need squash. I need this. I need that. And so I start to pull the elements. I need the investigative brochure. I need the protocol. I need to understand what is the country selection mix strategy. I need to understand also, which I think is very surprising to the teams when I come into the equation, because I will go to our business development team, our sales team, and I'll ask a very simple question. What was the sales strategy? What is the commercialization goal of the sponsor? How big are they? And what does their portfolio look like? Depending on these answers, I pivot and adjust my diversity action plan accordingly. If we're talking about a small biotech with one compound and every penny needs to stretch because on the next readout, that'll define whether they can raise more capital and so on and so forth, my approach is going to be vastly different. I'm going to be focusing on conservative measures and strategies of what is within their existing limit and reach. Because we got to keep it real, right? You don't want to set up people for failure. And two, looking at it from the perspective of how can this effective diversity action plan and strategy, regardless of what the outcome of the study, turn around and make them look good in their overarching commercial goals of growth and growth stage, et cetera. Very different from a much larger pharmaceutical company, right? At that point, my brain switches into, this is a drug failure mitigation strategy. And we point to Plavix, class action lawsuits in the state of Hawaii, like over $1 billion. I know that's not why we develop drugs. Nobody likes to, have a commercial drug fail. So we start to understand the ways in which we mitigate that and get our sponsors to think about this, not from the lens of a requirement that they're having to figure out, but as a comprehensive strategy that's going to touch upon the entire continuum of your clinical trial, Why? Because we want to ensure the strongest commercial launch for your product, and we can only do that if we ensure efficacy across the board, right? And so those are the starting building blocks. Now the assembly, yes, there's a framework, which is where the FDA guidance is helpful into kind of categorically guide me a little bit in the canvas, if you will, of developing that. I also pull in my superpower friends, and Kara, so my shout out to my good friend and dear colleague. We kind of glue ourselves to the hip, and we're like, I don't know how to describe that duo. She looks at the regulatory implication with commercial pathways, and we balance each other. I'm like, Amin, I hear you, but we need to operationalize. And then she'll go, no, I hear you, but GDPR and this, right? And so we do this teetering until we get the diversity action plan to a point where the sponsor looks at it and goes, I feel good about it. Thank you for guiding me in what to think. And it gets filed, right?
Yeah.
But as I'm building out section 4 of the measures to ensure diversity and inclusion, I'm already thinking how to work my way in reverse. What is the patient pathway and diagnostic pathway for these patients? Where are they? What type of facilities do they receive care? Is it an inpatient hospital, right? You can't do central recruitment, Facebook ads, and Instagram stories for a patient who's hospitalized in a coma. You got to really comprehensively look at all of those strategies, and then with an eye towards how am I going to implement this? And by I, that's the royal CRO I with my functional teams, right? And then how do I support them walking across that bridge, which is very scary because it's new and everyone tends to get nervous with anything that's new, and that's normal human, reaction. So it's a very messy in the beginning, a little bit messier in the middle. By the time we get over here, it's like, it makes sense, right? You look at the picture and you're like, everyone's like, I get it now.
Okay. So there is a lot to this process, and it's not one size fits all. There is art with the science, and you have to think through all those different competing lenses, because I loved how you touched on the fact that, when you say a diversity action plan, it doesn't mean that you're not thinking through how to have a well-designed and well-run study. And you're also looking for a lens of maybe there are potential opportunities for additional patient safety. Like, we want to make sure that the drugs are safe and effective for those they're intended to treat.
Right.
And so the only way you can do that is with designing studies and programs and strategies with these patients and users in mind. And then also trying to bring along everyone to the table. So this is a very daunting task. What role does technology play in any of this for you?
So for me, the best technology are the group of peoples and brain powers behind it who realize that they should probably understand what the problem is first, intimately, either through firsthand experience in that capacity or their own frustration of, man, this needs to be fixed, I'm gonna break out and design technology. The best technology has to put the end user at the middle of it. And the best technology in my mind is the one that we don't have to think about it because it's just there. The BlackBerry, one of my favorite phones in the world, period. I'm so sad they're not around because they're a little clicky. So satisfying. But we think about what Apple did when Steve Jobs pulled out an iPhone from his pocket and said, you don't need buttons. You don't need a stylus. And the world went, what? And he said, the best stylus in the world is already in your hand. And he pointed upward and powered it on. To me, that's technology. To me, that is, how does the user, whether it is your CRO, partner, or your sponsor, or the patients, when we deploy tech to patients, and I'm always looking at, the design of maybe vendors that deploy tech, and I wonder to myself, like, okay, so we're shipping a centrifuge to a patient, or we're shipping, a cell phone via FedEx that needs signature upon receipt, who may live in an apartment building, who may not be there when the gate needs to be buzzed. And instead of signing for it, they got to come home to a little sticky. and then try again tomorrow. And then at some point, you know what, I can't do this. I don't have time to be going to the FedEx, whatever, and figure it out. Return to center. Like, that is what I mean, right? You may have the best technology in the box, but if you can't get the patient to touch it or use it, or if you can't get your constituent to touch it and use it, the disconnect was in the deployment and the design of how to actually unlock its power. I love tech, and I think there's a lot of value in it. I've met so many founders of some of these tech giants, and their brain is so fascinating. But one consistent pattern that I've seen more often than not is they don't understand the last mile delivery, like Amazon Web Services, for instance. They figure that sucker out. And yeah, I think the right tech will just elevate and at scale, make the type of work that I just described, the type of strategies. Like, imagine if you can execute it like this, which is what we do. Now imagine if you can elevate and do it at scale, perhaps on an enterprise level. What does that look like, right? If I'm thinking CRO, sales strategy, competitive landscape, market share, guess what? Amin and I can probably talk about the altruistic need for diversity at phase 1 and phase 2, which that's what motivates me. When we look at the stressors of the economics of it, this applies to phase 3. So if I want to have overwhelming wins of phase 3, that means I have to figure out how to do this health equity and diversity and inclusion right. And so if you have a technology that elevates and now catapults this across your enterprise, what does that mean for you and your competitive landscape? That means sponsors can trust you more repeatedly for this work, this service. And you can handle it from a capability and bandwidth, because it no longer becomes a headcount situation of oh my God, we need to, clone Daniel times 10. No, get someone like me who can design that part, but then the technology deploys and automates. I've always thought about automation and scale, which I think is what landed me in early stage startup and venture capital, is because I think scale.
In order for this to be sustainable and not to be happenstance, and for it to actually get the adoption that's necessary, it needs to be scalable and reproducible and easy and simple and intuitive. So how can we make health equity to where it's like the stylus in the hand?
The dream, I think, has always been for a long time for me, even before this capacity, right? It's can you push one button? Just, there's different things out there that we have historically used. Can we design something like that for the health equity space? And what do I mean by that? All of the pieces that I described that I have to put out on the table on paper, in an ideal scenario, I shouldn't have to go pulling them from different sources and different places. Can we cohesively bring it all under the hood, right? I don't know, can you take a protocol that can, adapt from version to version, digitize it using AI analytics into a platform that you can then plug in your inclusion exclusion criteria, pulling directly, and doing a cross analysis that then connects to country and demographics and population. And then what does that mean for your recruitment measures? Well, and then can it blast the sites that have the history of it? Can it blast against the performance of other studies that right now we have to manually pull from ct.gov to do a patients per site per month analysis? Just touch it. And I feel like we've made strides and inched our way significantly there, and there's amazing work. I think the role that tech has played in how we're starting to look at these solutions, there's a lot of noise in the space, and I think that there is a lot of opportunistic entry points and penetration opportunities because the industry is so vulnerable right now with regards to introducing this element of uncertainty and sponsors getting anxious about solutions. And I think that the industry right now is contract execution happy and friendly, and they move quick. It is something that I have been a very balanced critic of. But on the flip side, we see efforts of companies like H1 that are being thoughtfully designed, not on the interface front first. And that's the part and the distinction that I respect and admire. It's let's back up and just think about this from a pathway perspective. Earlier, I spoke about what health equity looks like in that full continuum and pathway. I feel like one of the things that has been admirable about H1 amongst several is that, y'all have taken that spectrum and understood what data assets can actually lend value and unlock insight versus kind of making broad assumptions that a heat map alone may be, insightful. And that has become very obvious in the end product, in the latest developments with regards to the diversity modules and the insights and analytics there. But it starts with the design thinking, right? And you can't have the design thinking without the people and individuals in the room who have been there, who have done that, who have the boots on the ground experience, who are committed to keeping an ear to the ground. And, personally, right, as a friend and as a colleague I've admired since your earliest years in your career, it's evident. Your brand, your infused way of thinking is evident in these latest developments, further enhanced by the team of incredibly talented people you now work alongside. And so I think that's kind of where it would be prudent to see more companies think in that direction.
Well, you're incredibly kind. But yes, I think organizations that take the end user in mind, right? And thinking through patient pathways, thinking through the Maslow hierarchy, right? And so looking at what are those social determinants that could be barriers, and bridging the gap between disparate data sources and bringing it all together to really give a good composite picture to at least help support organizations like yours, yourself, and coming up with thoughtful plans that are informed, that take into account what a provider might be going through, what they're thinking, the languages that they speak, and how that might translate to the patients that they serve. And looking through all those different components to really help shape the design of health equity and implementation on these trials. And so, CROs also bridge a very interesting divide in being able to look across the gamut, across a multitude of various different designs, studies, trials, within a same therapeutic area. They can look at within different classes. And so having just a repository of knowledge and being able to peel that out and then basically shape design in a really novel way. So I'm also curious from your perspective, can you explain to us the process of how CROs can help support and ensure health equity from your perspective?
It's my first rodeo at a CRO. And I've been able to, now that I'm on this side of the moon, have such a deep, deep admiration for exactly what you just described, right? The visibility and the exposure to the different therapeutic classes and indication. I mean, man, you learn so much. And I oftentimes wonder, right? You can spend time designing solutions at the CRO level with the impact at scale across so many therapeutic areas. Or you can design health equity solutions at the sponsor level and develop and have the impact at a portfolio or compound. And there's profound value in that. But you at some point inevitably need to go shopping for your CRO partner, and you can have an incredibly well-designed strategy that's been built, but your CRO then needs to be tasked to execute. What CROs can do is have an adaptability for both of those models, where you have a sponsor who needs help crafting this from the ground up and they're unsure. Have the muscle power and the thinking and maybe the systemic process in place. It could look like an analysis. I mean, we do this all the time when proposals come in. There's a feasibility review, there's a patient recruitment analysis, et cetera. What about the health equity analysis? What about the structured, hey, as part of the strategy, I'm going to convene the medical director, I'm going to convene the country regulatory person to come together and look at a holistic design early, as opposed to an afterthought much later down the road. And then adapt the strategy according to what type of sponsor you're interacting with. Is it a large sponsor? Like, I always admire the work that Lilly has done in the space, true pioneers. They're going to come with their cake recipe and say, nope, there it is, we already thought about it, that's what we need to do. Adapt the muscle to be able to operationally rise to that directive. And then you're going to have smaller biotech companies that are just like, I don't even know where it needs to go to the, I don't even know who to talk to at the FDA, guide them and be able to have the muscle power. Nonetheless, you activate the same pathways, right? Because in both scenarios, guess what? You're gonna have to bake the cake, whether you got the recipe or not, right? So it's a really important role, and I think it's one to consider the long-term, trajectory of what that's going to look like as the industry continues to morph and adapt.
So, this has truly been an honor, and I want to ask you one final question, if it allows for it. So, what will happen in the world if you are successful in your role of making a difference in health equity? Well, how will that change healthcare?
Well, we started the interview with the simplicity, and I'll end it with the simplicity. My first day at Cedars-Sinai back in 2009, I stepped out of the elevator for work on day one, and again, it was a very simple, I'm here to heal. I'm here to heal, whether that means I pursued nursing or medical school, etc. I'm here to heal, and I think that's fundamentally the crux and the foundation of all things in healthcare, period. When our doctors take the pledge and they do the Hippocratic Oath, it is integral to everything that they do. I think if I'm remotely successful, I'll say it this way, and I can leave even the slightest scratch on the surface of all of this, because I can't do it alone. I have to look across, across lines and look at my colleagues and my peers who, we know each other, we support each other at different CROs. This is how we're all collectively thinking. And if we can collectively make that dent, I think it'll look like someone one day stepping out of the elevator on their first day at work at a hospital in the future with the feeling of wanting to heal people and knowing that they can actually do that without the limitation of only the select privileged people who can seek care in this organization. And I think that's fundamentally what matters.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.